Hello to the next section of communication and technology. The last classes, we looked into the development of writing in history from the earliest predecessors of writing, the proto-writing, to unfolding all the different writing systems that we have now in the world. And today we will look for the next step, what to do with the written texts. And of course, this is the story of books and libraries. So this is the Brooklyn Public Library, one of the magnificent public libraries in the United States, a monument of public knowledge and serving the public with education. Many books are available here and have been for as long as the United States have been around. And to celebrate that and make that clear, it is written in stone here to the right of the main entrance. Here are enshrined the longing of great hearts and noble things that tower above the tide, the magic word that winged wonder starts, the garnered wisdom that has never died. Well, this was written by the then commissioner of the library, Roscoe Conking Ensign Brown. So, so the clay tablets are indeed the oldest form of what we could think of books. We have looked into that last time. This is probably the oldest known, the temple hymn of the Kesh Temple. It's about 3,800, that's almost 4,000 years old. It's in the Bronze Age, in the Old Bronze Age, Mesopotamia. And when I say a book, so this is indeed literature. It is not accounting. It is not just a text that deals with everyday necessities, not a law or another text of what we would regard as low cultural significance. So this is indeed something that people wrote with imagination, with their creativity. It is a proper form of literature. It is poetry. So this is the tablet. Another form that is almost as old as the tablet is the scroll. And again, I looked into what is the oldest scroll. So that is the fragments of papyri found at the Wadi Jarf at the Red Sea. So this is Egyptian. It's found in 2013 by French archaeologists, and is much older than the cuneiform tablet that I showed in the first picture. It is actually from 2500 before our time. That means it is 4,500 years old. And it is a very interesting writing. You can have a look into the unfolded page. It's more than that. So it is the diary. It's kind of a logbook of an inspector of the construction site of the large pyramid of the pharaoh Cheops. And he writes down diligently what he did every day and what his men did. So he describes, for example, how he goes down to inspect a load of stones, of limestone that comes from Heliopolis, loaded with the building materials. And on the next day, he spends the day with his platoon of men while they haul stones up to the building site and so on. So we have about 5 months of this minutes of the day in the construction site. I mean, of course, this is an invaluably precious document that gives us insight into the time of the Bronze Age at the beginning of the early Iron Age. So this is about 4,500 years old. Yeah, why do I say a scroll? I mean, doesn't it look just like a piece of paper? Well, a scroll means that it was rolled up to be stored and also to be transported in a bag. So in this kitschy painting by Lawrence Alma Tadama, a Dutch-British painter of the 19th century, we see how we can imagine the scroll to be read. It is these pieces of papyrus, of paper-like material, glued or sewn together into large bands that were rolled up, and you would read by rolling one side down and one side up, page by page. These scrolls could be many meters in length. This is exactly here the guy who reads Homer here to his friends. Yes, the Laurel, so he is probably a poet. He has the scroll a bit leisurely, I would say. It's not very strict how he holds that. So this is the scroll. The Latin word for scroll is volumen. So volumen means actually rolled up, or rotulus. So this is other words, and our word that we have a volume of a book that comes from volumen, the rolled up scrolled in Latin. So we have the tablet, we have the scroll, and of course we have the proper book, which is the so-called codex. So again, this is the oldest known codex. It's much, much later. So the codex has not been a thing before like 2000 years ago. So the Codex Sinaiticus, as the name says, was found on the Sinai. And actually, it was found in the St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. So this monastery is probably the oldest monastery around. It has been around since the late 3rd or early 4th century, which is really a long time. I mean, this is the early time of the Christian church, and it is still kind of a holy place in the Coptic Christian church in Egypt. And in the early 19th century, in 1844, a German scholar, Konstantin von Tischendorf, found several hundred leaves of a book, which is the Bible, almost complete New Testament with all four Gospels, and a large part of the Old Testament in the Greek translation, the so-called Septuaginta. And it is almost from the beginning of the monastery. It's early 4th century. So it is about 1600 years old. And you see the letters written on parchment. We will see of the ink and the parchment, how that is made. I mean, these letters, these Greek letters, are perfectly well readable. It's a beautiful handwriting. It's a beautiful font. It's called uncial, unciale, uncial. It's this type of rounded capital letters. So these are the main Western types of book: the tablet, the scroll, and the codex. I mean, of course, there were many other forms in which people put writing. So one of the oldest surviving are these Chinese oracle bones. So they are older than any books that we have from East Asia. So the Chinese would use these bones for divination. So they would throw the bones to tell the future. And later, from these writings on the bones, evolved manuscripts, evolved books. So another example from a different culture is these Javanese palm leaf books. So actually, I mean, why not write on palm leaves? And we will later see other materials too. So the palm leaves were bound like that and then kind of read piece by piece. So now let's have a look into this old bookmaking. This beautiful manuscript is about 1,000 years old. It is actually only one page in a collection of parchment papers, of parchment pages that were bound together later into one volume. So what we see here is the so-called Bamberger Schreiberbild. So it is in Bamberg, in northern Bavaria, in Germany, a city that was founded in 1007. So about 1,000 years ago, and then was equipped with all you needed for this new city that was kind of a stronghold of Christianity in the still pagan Slavic realms of the Northeast. I mean, unthinkable today that it would ever be like that, but at that time that was kind of a pioneer outpost that Emperor Henry II let build there. So Bamberg had a big cathedral still there and became well known for its magnificent library at that time and had a school of scribes. So there were many monks engaged in book production around the year 1000. This page is what we have as a documentation that the monks made about their bookmaking. It is not usually the case that at that time people would reflect on themselves. So we have not that many direct illustrations about what people did to produce these books. So it is really an extraordinary example of beautiful bookmaking. The style at that time, the style at around the year 1000 to 1100 is called Romanesque. So it's the Romanesque style. So let's start and see how the book is actually made. So the first step, of course, is your concept. I mean, you have to get an idea what book you want to make. And so the monk sketches out what should be in the book. And since parchment, as we will see, is incredibly valuable, this has to be done in a very deliberate way. The material that's used for making these sketches can be any kind of ephemeral throwaway things. So it could be scratched in the ground, but also, as we see here, in these small tablets of wax that had been in use for that since the early time of the Sumerians, thousands years earlier. So the monk, the scribe, sketches the book in wax to get a layout, to know what to put on which page, where to put illustrations, and where to put text, and so on. And also, of course, how many pages he will need to make the book. So then we need parchment. So the parchment making was the most expensive part of the bookmaking. And to produce parchment, you would use goat, sheep, or calf skin. And the skin would be scraped after lying in a brine of limestone. So it's made differently than leather. This brimstone brine makes the skin very white, very shiny, very smooth, but very firm. And with this lunellum, this crescent-shaped knife, the parchment is scraped very thin so that we get a very nice leaf that we can then write on. I mean, I said it is very expensive. I mean, you can imagine that you can't make more than basically one leaf of parchment from one animal. So if you have books that are 100 or 200 leaves, that means that you have to slaughter several flocks of cattle to get that. I mean, a book was as expensive or could be as expensive as a whole village. This is why we don't have that many books of that time. Of course, paper or papyrus or other plant-based pages would have been so much more favorable, but they were not available that well at that time. Since the late antiquity, the supply of material from which you could make papyrus, which came basically from Egypt, there's no place in Europe except one small growth where the papyrus plant grows, had slowed down. So papyrus was not available anymore. And paper making, although that was very common in China since early on, I mean, like 2000 years and more ago, longer ago, the Chinese would already know how to make paper from plants. This had not made its way to the West yet. In the Islamic world, closer to the Chinese and with much better trade relations into the Far East, paper making arrived much, much earlier than in Europe. So around that time, when we see this parchment of bookmaking being painted in northern Bavaria, people in Baghdad and other parts of the Caliphate would already have proper paper making and would therefore be able to produce books much, much cheaper and in much larger quantities. Not so in the medieval Europe. I mean, people were quite behind in that respect. And the good thing about parchment, it lasts forever. I mean, if you don't put the book into a place that's very wet, it is actually almost indestructible. It doesn't burn very well. It stays, I mean, no matter what climate is in the library, it is very forgiving. And so we have these books, they are 1,000 years of age or older, if you think of the Codex Sinaiticus, 1,700 years of age, that look basically as they had been written like a few years ago. So this is the parchment, which is the pages on which the book is written. So these leaves are not pages yet. They had to be cut into the rectangular shape, of course. This is shown here. A sharp knife is then also used to scratch thin lines onto the parchment on which the writing would be then adjusted so that you have a very nice set of letters that don't tilt or change in size. So next, the scribe now comes and sharpens their quill. That was usually made from the feathers of geese. They have a nice diameter, and you can use them to hold quite some ink, so you can write several letters with one dip into the ink pot. I mean, of course, also, I mean, with the inscriptions, once the book was inscribed, another monk, another artist would then illuminate. Illumination means put light into the book, which means these illuminators were artist painters, because I mean, as mentioned, the book was incredibly valuable, so you better illustrate it with the best of art, and you would place meaningful illustrations into the page. Sometimes the illustrations would be full pages also, and there is scientific evidence that the scribes would send the half-ready books to other monasteries, to other scriptoria, where they had better draftsmen. They would more artfully illustrate. So other than with the usual production in monasteries, which was very local, the books were sometimes sent over quite some distance to other monasteries to be finally accomplished. So the leaf is not a page. I mean, as everyone knows, I mean, who has ever torn a book apart, you know that in our books today, that is still the case, that we fold the leaves into pages. And you can do that in various ways. I mean, you can take the leaf and just fold it once. and have basically the book made of these folded, wing like butterfly like wings of pages. This is called folio. Folio in Latin means leaf, like the leaf of a tree, but also the sheet of paper. So these sheets of parchment, folded once in the middle, is folio. That's the size of the book. That's, of course, the largest books. But if you have smaller books, not every book has to be very large. You can have smaller books. It's more practical if you sit in a library and read, of course. Then you fold them twice. So if you fold it once, you have 2 pages on either side of the parchment. So 2 makes 4 pages on one leaf. If you fold twice, you have 4 pages on either side. That means 8 pages per leaf. And then, of course, if you fold it twice, I mean, you have to cut it because otherwise you couldn't leaf through it. And then you could fold it 3 times. Then you have 8 on either side. That means 16 pages. And by the Latin words of the numbers, so folio is basically the one sheet of leaf made into pages. If you fold it twice, you have 4, as mentioned. That's called quarto. So quart in English, means 4. And if you fold twice, you have 8, and that's called octavo. Oct means 8. So, and this is how we call the sizes of book today. I mean, the so-called pocket book is octavo. That is because the sheets made from these leaves are still folded into these 8 pages on one side. And larger books, like art catalogs or large coffee table books, as we call them now, they are called quarto. There's very few folio books. In ancient times, the folio book was mainly used in liturgy, like in the service, but that is not only in Christian religion, of course, also in other cultures. These big books, you use them in places where many people have to look them at one time. So you write in big letters to make it easier in the dimly lit churches, in the mosque, or in other places of worship, that many people could still read it from a bit of a distance. While if you make smaller formats, it's much harder to read, but of course you can get much more space out of the book. And these books were usually used for scholarship, like preparing for your service, but also for doing research, and later for the prayers. But that is much later. It's 500 years after this book was painted, came these private prayer books that were owned by single people. So now we have the pages. They have to be bound together. That's the next step. There's thread that can be wool, that can be rope, and can be leather. All kinds of thread materials have been used. And finally, we need to cover the book, and the cover at that time was mainly wood. There's also books made of leather, so they would have more flexible cover, or wood that is then itself covered in leather, that it is more pleasant to hold. Some very rare books have covers of metal also. And then the cover would usually get forged metal hardware, like protecting the edges, protecting the back, that would be nailed on top of it. It can then, of course, also be embellished with precious metals or precious gemstones or ivory, as we see in many book bindings. And now the book is ready, and the monk proudly presents it, probably to his colleagues. So let's see how the writing took place. And of course, if we write by hand, we think of ink. One of the most common inks early on is the so-called iron gull ink. So the oak apple contains, I mean, that is a growth that is produced by a wasp that stings into the oak and makes the oak grow, the so-called gall apple or oak apple, and that contains what's called gallic acid or tannic acid. It is it is an oxidizer that, together with iron sulfide, creates a beautiful dark, almost purple black solution. Um, that is actually what we use in ink most of the time. It is not what we call document safe. It can oxidize the paper and destroy the paper over time. But still, I think it is the most common pigment that we have in ink to this day if you use a fountain pen. Um, Much less corrosive, however, not as durable, is the so-called lamp black. So yeah, United Nuclear sounds scary. I mean, I have chemicals from United Nuclear. They are a chemical special supplier. You can buy all kinds of chemicals, and I mean, why it is lamp black special? It is basically just pure carbon. The specialness comes that it is very thin, very finely ground carbon. And how would you get that? So you would burn things and let the soot come on a cold surface, like a sheet of metal or glass or ceramics or so, and then scrape it off. This is in medieval times how the lamp black was produced. This is the name, hence, because it is the glass around a lamp, around the candle, over time gets black of the soot, and the soot is the lamp black. The point is that the lamp black is beautifully black. However, it is easy to smear it away. So books made of lamp black inks are usually not as durable as those of the gall ink. Then, of course, we have colored inks. The most magnificent are the gold inks. So this is a page of a so-called gold Quran. It was probably made in Tunisia around 900, so in the fourth century age, so 900 to 950 our time, and it is parchment dyed with indigo, the color that we will talk about in a second, written on in a gold ink. It is on display, or was at least when I was there last, in Sharjah in the Calligraphy Museum. So then we have the so-called minium. So minium is a highly toxic ink. It is lead oxide. I mean, all lead compounds are highly toxic, and you see the red lines, the red writing in the middle of the page, and that is written with this red ink, the minium. So red in Latin is called rubrum, and these red lines that mark the paragraphs, that mark a new chapter in the book or a subchapter in the book, are called rubric because they are red. And our word rubric today, which we say for a category or a subchapter, a subsection or so, comes from this red ink, the minium. Minium also gives the word miniature. So the miniature is the tiny, delicate painting on the book made by the red ink. So while of course it can have all kinds of colors, the miniature has its name from minium, the lead red. And today we say something is miniature because it is as delicate and small as the illustration, the illuminations of these books. The book here is a 15th century codex that is on display, or was on display at least last time I was there, in the Louvre, Abu Dhabi. Minium as a red ink has been around also at least as early as 300 before our time, so like 2,400, 2,500 years ago. In China, people would already use these red inks made from lead. Finally, of course, I mean, all these powdery things don't stick to the page by themselves. You need to glue them together. And this is done by so-called gum arabic. So gum arabic is a dried sap from the acacia tree, which is very common here in the Middle East. So this acacia resin, the sap, gives the glue. It's the original paper glue that people used also to make the ink stick to the pages. So next chapter we open is the illumination, bringing pictures and paint the books. This is not done with gum arabic, so the pigments, as in book painting, same as in painting large formats on table, on wood, on canvas or whatever, is at that time exclusively done with egg tempera. So you use basically egg, the egg white, which gets really sticky and hard when it dries, to make the pigments stick to the pages the same way you make them stick to the pane of wood you paint on or the canvas. So this is a nice kind of sketch around 1400 in Italy that a book painter made that to try out the quality and characteristics of various pigments. And we can use that now to look what pigments they had. So first, if you look at the green and brown pigments here, that is earth pigments. These earth pigments, they are very abundant. They are basically various forms of iron oxides like ochre or terre verte. So terre verte or terra verte is this greenish, basically chemically is very similar to ochre. So these are the earth. Then we have ultramarine. So ultramarine is by far the most expensive thing that people had to paint or to make any art in the Middle Ages. It is so expensive because the stone from which it was ground, the lapis lazuli, only occurs in Afghanistan, which in like 1,000 years ago was really hard to reach. And so ultramarine was way more precious than gold or silver. So Cennini, a scholar and artist who was writing about the color making, calls ultramarine, that is the color illustrious, beautiful, and most perfect, beyond all other colors. One could not say anything about it or do anything with it that its quality would not still surpass. So the ultramarine was therefore reserved for the most holy things that you would put on your page. In the Christian manuscript, that would, for example, be the cloak of the Holy Mother Mary. That is always blue, and that was usually made by ultramarine. So another pigment is vermilion. So we have seen one red pigment already, minium, which is lead oxide. Vermilion is mercury sulfate. So although mercury we think of as being also very poisonous, and as is lead, actually the mercury sulfate is not as poisonous as mercury or as the lead, as all of lead components. So the vermilion was preferable to the minium, and almost entirely replaced it over time. So the later manuscripts all use vermilion. So the mineral from which is made is the cinnabar. So cinnabar is this mercury sulfide that's turned into this bright red pigment. So we have malachite and azurite, that semi-precious stones. They are common for making stone carved things out of it. Also, greenish and bluish pigments. And that's as far. So there's a few minerals that I didn't find on this page, so I put them in here separately. So auripigment and realgar or realgar, so auripigment or auripigment, are also incredibly poisonous and very common in book painting. So the auripigment or king's yellow is an arsenic compound, and it's famous, I think, from the book "The Name of the Rose" by Umberto Eco, because this is how the people get poisoned there. Indeed, it was used as early as the 31st century BCE, so like 5,000 years ago already, um, to paint things, and as early as I think around 2,000 years ago, it was used in China to make pages, to dye pages in this yellowish tone that would repel insects. I don't know how they actually would then flip the pages. Seems a bit kind of precarious to touch that. So these toxic properties were known to the ancients. I mean, they were not stupid. They knew that it was quite poisonous. So orpiment and realgar. And then, of course, we have white. So white is also usually lead white. It has been used as a paint until the 20th century, when it was replaced by titanium dioxide. So that's basically lead carbonate. So you take lead and let it sit in vinegar for a while, and then you scrape off the white pigment that forms on top of it. So it is incredibly poisonous again if you eat it. And nevertheless, it was also used until, like, I don't know, 200 years ago or so, as a cosmetics, and sometimes is still found in cosmetics, in handmade cosmetics in Asia. As I've just read in an article about poisoning of women that paint their faces white with this lead paint. So the lead white you see here is used, for example, to paint this white veil over the Prophet Muhammad, which is a very common depiction of Muhammad in Ottoman book painting. The book here is in Istanbul. It is of Ottoman times, so it's around it's in the 16th or 17th century. So that was all the mineral pigments. Now let's look on have a look on pigments that made from plants. So the plant pigments are often less durable. As you all know, plant pigments change their color under light, so they are more delicate to keep. And again, we have this funny sketchbook. It's a bit newer than the other that I had. So let's have here first. That's Karablak in German, or lac, lake in English or French. That is a plant that produces this dye. It can be used in any dye-based pigment now. but originally it's only the crab that produces it. Then we have the Brazil, the country Brazil has its name from it, that is made from a wood, from Brasilholz, Brazil wood, and create this beautiful rose color. And then we have indigo. Indigo is made from the plant called woad. It's super common still as a color. The blue jeans, for example, is dyed with indigo. The woad is all over the Middle East. If you go to the spice souk, for example, all the spice sellers sell you these beautiful blue pieces of indigo. The dyeing process is a bit tricky. You can't just do that directly. If you just dissolve the indigo powder and dye things, they get kind of a very light reddish color. So you have to use an oxidant to maintain the blue in solution and then dye the fabric or the page with it. So that's indigo. Then we have tortoise bile. That sounds very unpleasant, and it is. But I mean, tortoises were food in many countries around the Mediterranean, and so the bile of a tortoise obviously is very yellow, kind of greenish yellow. Um, so carmine is another animal-based pigment. So the carmine is made from lice, from the cochineal. So cochineal lice, if you see them sometimes on stones, these very, very small, they are mites actually, red mites. They create an orange-red, very strong orange-red color. That was used to substitute the most expensive of all dyes. So we have seen the most expensive inorganic pigment, which is ultramarine, the lapis lazuli for the blue. Now comes the most expensive organic pigment, which is also animal-based. It is red and it is purple. So purple, since antiquity, has been used to dye fabric, in particular the fabric of rulers. So it is a kind of synonymous for people in power, be it a king or a bishop, people of the highest power, for example, in Rome. Only the most powerful people, like the senators or the censors, would have purple strips on their toga, on their overcloth. So the purple that we see here is the marriage charter of Empress Theophanu, who was a Byzantine princess who married the Holy Roman German King Otto III around the year 1000. So it's, I think, 997 when they married. That was a huge achievement for the emperor to be married with the daughter of the Byzantine emperor, because Theophanu would not only come on her own, she would have all her court with her, and there was many scholars, scribes, artists, and they brought all kinds of material with them, among them beautiful ivory and also the knowledge of dyeing parchment with purple. So this is a huge advancement in technique to produce books, is to dye the pages and then to apply the gold ink on top of it. So, I mean, that's quite a document. It is a meter and 50 centimeters long, so it's almost as large as a person and about 40 centimeters wide. Yeah, that leads now, of course, to the question. So we have seen parchment, we've seen papyrus. What about paper? And this is indeed the next chapter, which we will have a look at. Well, paper has been around in China since really ancient times. The earliest mentioning is more than 2000 years ago by Kai Lun, a Chinese paper expert, who first described a standardized way of making paper over 100 years before our time. So these woodcuts from around 1500 our time, so about 500 years ago, these woodcuts illustrate Kai Lun's paper making method in 5 steps. And it is really important to understand that paper has been in China for such a long time and then see how slowly it made its way to the West. So the first step is the moisturing of the fibrous plants. Paper is made, I mean, like papyrus in the West was made from fibrous plants. Basically, the Chinese would use any plant that can be dissolved and get these mud structures from. At Kai Lun's time, it was basically bamboo. Later, most of the Chinese paper was made from mulberry. As it is, by the way, today, it is still mulberry and cotton are the most common fibers that are used for the cellulose in paper making to this day. Cotton, of course, at that time in Eurasia was not known. It is native to the Americas. So that is part of the so-called Columbian exchange. That is the bringing back and forth all the plants and animals that were discovered in the Americas by the Europeans when they came in the around 1500 and conquered this land. And they brought all these vegetables, all the fruit, and all the techniques and things known to the native people there back to Europe and also to Asia. And growing cotton as potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, you name it. They all came around 1500 in this so-called Columbian exchange. That is one of the pivotal points, I think, in human history, not only because the conquest of the Americas marks one of the most cruel genocides that ever happened, but also because it profoundly changed what materials, in particular plants, would have been available in Europe and Asia. Well, we are with these woodcuts directly at the edge of that, so we are not quite there. So the Chinese would not have cotton yet. So they would use what is available in China at that time, like bamboo or mulberry, and dissolve these plants in water, and they are really mushy, so to say. And this mushy mash is then brought to boil until it gets this so-called pulp. This is, by the way, exactly how paper is made today. So there has nothing changed in over 2000 years in paper making. So the first step is dissolving the cellulose from the plants. The second is to boil it into pulp, that it is a quite homogeneous pulp of fibrous mash. The next step is casting the pulp on nets. So the Chinese, as we would today, would have these kind of sieve-like mats, screens basically, that could be silk screens or other textile, on which you bring out the pulp very thinly and then press it so that all the water goes out. And the pulp forms a pressed mat, a thin sheet of almost dry, yeah, pressed pulp. And that then is dried and cut into leaves. So these are the 5 steps of paper making. Today, of course, we have machines that roll out paper in endless bands on which we can print. And we will look into the development of first making these endless bands of rolls of paper and then cutting them up again in bookmaking after the invention of the printing press, which, by the way, again happened in East Asia much earlier than in Europe. So, and indeed, the invention of paper making didn't happen independently in many places. It just happened in China, and from there diffused over the centuries. First, I mean, across the way of the Silk Road, as you can see, all the way through the Chinese mainland, through South Asia, through what today is India, into Persia, and reached Baghdad around the time of the Prophet. So it is indeed in the first caliphate that the caliphate of the Abbasids, that Islam could already make use of paper instead of parchment or papyrus. And it is really important because it played a significant role in the spread of Islamic teaching and philosophy and science, and is one of the things that made, as we will discuss a bit later, the time that followed the 500 years following bringing paper into Baghdad to the golden age of bookmaking in the Muslim world. Yeah, and then very slowly it progressed into Europe, where it took another 500 years to actually arrive. But around the year 1250, paper making was already common in monasteries. However, there was no good plants in Europe that you would actually make into good paper. There's only trees that you would have to grind up, and the tree-based paper is very sour. It doesn't last long. So within one generation, I mean, if you're a bookmaker and you print on this on European wood-based paper, you see your books decay within your lifetime. This is really an unfortunate fate of the books, because that meant that the Europeans, for the time being, had to stick to parchment, which was so much more expensive, and could only use paper for scrap. And most of that has not survived. So most of the paper of that time has long decayed, and it is only by lucky coincidence in some libraries where the climate conditions prevented the paper of that time to decay. So that, of course, changed after the introduction of cotton-based paper in the 16th century in particular, in the late 15th and then 16th century, when the paper quality greatly increased. The Europeans had a second line of paper making also that is using linen. So linen and other plant-based textiles could be shredded into rags, and these rags being turned into paper. This was quite expensive and is the basis of the first lasting book made into printed paper books around the year 1500. So after looking into the materials on which we write, parchment, papyrus, and paper, the next step is, of course, to get the book together into the codex, into the volume of a book. And as mentioned earlier, the binding was an important part to also preserve the book. And since books were so expensive, no wonder that people put some effort into how they looked from the outside. So this is a 13th century Bible, a parchment Bible, in octavo format, as you might remember. That means it's folded 3 times so that you have 8 pages on each side of the parchment leaf, and then it is cut and bound. So this is a small book. It is a Bible for personal use. It is probably lying on the altar or used by the bishop but not used by the whole parish to see the readings and the illustrations. So this is already a quite precious small scale book for personal use. And accordingly, I mean, the gemstones on the outside, I mean, you see various semi-precious stones, like, for example, the lapis lazuli in the middle of the upper row, um, are made in the fashion of the Roman gems. They are also very intricate. I mean, they are meant to be looked from a close distance. They don't have a lasting over a distance shape. There's only the colors. So the people in the parish, they would see, oh, there's nice fancy colors on it. But the bishop himself, he would see that they are beautifully cut also. The binding, by the way, is much later. The binding is Renaissance. So the book was held in great esteem even centuries after printing was invented. Clearly, the bishop would still value this manuscript, handwritten and hand painted, and give it a new binding in this beautiful Renaissance craftswork. So now let's look into 4 examples of the books. Four really outstanding examples, I would say, that I have chosen for you. Books that I myself find very meaningful and that I can never stop admiring for what they convey over the centuries or millennia. So the first book is one of the oldest books that we have, actually. It is the so-called Vienna Genesis, so the Wiener Genesis. And so that is a book of the Bible, of the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, that is the creation and other stories of very early times. And it was written in Greek. It is the Greek translation of the Old Hebrew of the Old Testament, the so-called Septuagint. Um, and it is probably Syrian craftswork and shows you, I mean, the magnificent crafts of Syrian scriptoria at that time. It is written in a silver ink and the holy names in gold. The silver ink, unfortunately, is a bit corrosive, so the parchment has been destroyed over some of the letters. Nevertheless, 24 pages survived the 1500 years since it was written, with all in all 48 miniatures in beautiful watercolors. The parchment itself is dyed with purple. So, as I mentioned, purple is made from the purple snail and was usually used to dye textile. It's much more difficult to paint with it also because I mean it stays kind of gluey and I mean you get it. I mean it's from a snail, it's smeary. And so the dyeing of the parchment is probably the best you can do with the purple. It's not so much an ink or a color by which you draw. If you look into the details, so you see the uncial writing. The uncial is the font in it is written. It exists in Greek and Latin as a font. So this is the story of creation of the humans. As you know, Adam and Eve, and here you see Eve harvesting picking the apple and giving that to Adam, which is such an interesting story. I mean, if you think of that Adam and Eve were living in paradise, not knowing that they would die, but of course they were mortal as all other created animals, and by enlightening themselves, by Eve taking this courageous step to say, well, I don't mind, I want to know, here, let's pick the apple. They realize that they will die and that they are naked. I mean, and as Heidegger would say, animals perish, only humans die. And I think this realization of their nakedness and hiding before God's eye behind that bush is really beautifully depicted. Yeah, more than 1500 years ago. So here, another very famous story, the story of the Great Flood and Noah's Ark. As told earlier, this is originally Babylonian myth that was included in a syncretist way into the Old Testament, into the Jewish religion. And what you see here is, I think, the depiction as the story of the Great Flood is to this day. I mean, you have this box-like ark and all the animals going in and out here. I mean, it's obviously after landing on the mountain of Ararat. So this is the Vienna Genesis, one of the oldest biblical books, and is one of the oldest biblical writings that have survived over time. There's only a few that are older. You might know of the Qumran papyrus, so the papyrus scrolls found near the Dead Sea in Israel. I mean, they have been discovered over a long time. More and more have been discovered. There is some really important biblical writing on that too. But the Vienna Genesis is a book, so that is different. It's not a scroll, it is bound into a book, as you can see. It was very expensive. It is certainly at its time one of the most expensive books that people could have. So let's look at another book, Change in Time. This is the book Al-Diryak, so Kitab Al-Diryak, which is a very common scientific manuscript in the golden age of Arab science, kind of this first great scientific age from around 800 to around 1200 our time. So this book was made in the Hijra year 595. And it is today in the Paris National Library, therefore it's called the Paris Manuscript, and was written in the Seljuk Empire, so north of Baghdad. And the text, however, is a Greek text written by a Greek, probably late antiquity scholar in Byzantium, John the Grammarian, who in Arabic is Yahya al-Nawawi. I hope I don't make a fool of myself pronouncing these things. So Yahya al-Nawawi is the author of this pseudonymous manuscript, which is attributed to the very famous classic Greek physician Galenos, Galen. So that was very common, that you write a book and you think, well, I'm not that famous, so better give it more authority by giving authorship to someone who's long dead, as in the case with Galenos. And this, I mean, Kitab al-Diryak means kind of the universal potion, the universal medication. So it's a collection of medical advice, in particular of making medicine. And if you look at it, so you see here the portraits of the physicians that contributed. I mean, they are all legendary. The book is painted 1,000 years after these people had lived, or more than 1,000 years. So you see Marinus on the left, Andromachus the Elder in the middle, and Andromachus the Younger on the right. So these are these authorities that are depicted here, that everyone believes. Well, these people, I mean, they have gray beards and look very wise. They must really know. And if you look closely also, I mean, into the beautiful calligraphy, the stylized Kufic writing in black and the beautiful ornaments behind it, that shows you that at that time the what is today Iraq had an outstanding book culture. So Baghdad was the city that had the most scribes in the world. There were legendary over 100 libraries with scribes, with people who could read and write and would copy all the manuscript. And the Caliph would insist that every book that is found in the empire would have to be sent to Baghdad to be copied. And therefore, an enormous treasure of wisdom piled up in Baghdad. In particular, everything that had been preserved from the time of the late antiquity, like when the West Roman Empire collapsed around 500, and the major European culture was only in Byzantium at that time. Byzantium, also one of the great power centers with great culture. So in Byzantium, the philosophy and science of the ancient Greeks and Romans was preserved, while in the West, most of it was lost. And from Byzantium, it made its way into the into the Arab-speaking world. The same happened in Andalus, in today's Spain. So a lot of Roman writing survived there. There were a lot of scholars. They were not all Muslims. There were also Jewish and Christian scholars. As you know, these times were very tolerant, and people could exercise could practice their own religions unbothered. And so a multitude of different philosophies flourished at that time with its center in probably the center of the civilized world in the West, which was Baghdad. So we have seen an classic Christian text, one of the most important antique Christian texts with the Vienna Genesis. We have now seen a secular text, there's a non-religious book of great value of the medieval Islamic world. Now let's move to a totally different part of the world, to the Americas. And I think that it is not so well known in the West that the Mesoamerican cultures, the Maya cultures, that had a civilization that would have writing as early as 2000 years ago. So writing systems emerged not only in Eurasia, so not only in Mesopotamia, and spreading from Mesopotamia across Egypt, across the Mediterranean, all over Europe, and in China, in the Huanghu river delta, spreading around all Asia. No, writing also independently was developed around the same time, basically, in the great American civilizations. Here, with the example of the Mayans. So the Mayan civilization lasted for about 2000 years. It was in decline already around the time when this book was written. It's in the late Mayan times, but most of what Mayan culture was totally annihilated by the European conquest. So the European came, and the Mayans would get sick from these infections, in particular from the smallpox that the Europeans brought with them. And more than 95% of the Mayan population in Mesoamerica died within a century. That is the hugest extinction of human beings that we know of that ever took place. It is really the most horrible genocide of the ancient world, only surpassed, of course, by the horrible things that happened then in the 20th century. So this is the very dark side, and we are really lucky that only 4 codices, 4 books written in the Mayan script survived from probably thousands of texts that had been written into books. We still have about 8,000 Mayan inscriptions, mainly stone and architectural elements, as well as ceramics. I mean, these are much harder to destroy, but on the other hand, the problem with inscriptions on stone and ceramics is that they are usually of very different meaning than what you would write in a book. So central narrative, literature, and religious writing is usually kept in books, not written on walls, because it needs space. And the Dresden Codex in particular is something that was written into a book not only for worship, but also practical use, because it contains the Mayan numerical system to calculate a calendar. So it is an almanac. An almanac means that it describes the various holidays, the feasts of a year. So 260 different feasts are described here, and how you identify them, seeing the celestial bodies like the moon and the sun and the planets move. And the Mayan had a calendar that would run over eons of time, like 35,000 years, would span one episode of what they would describe. So as I will show you in a second, the pictures are of the highest skills craftsmanship, um, and drawn by a person who certainly had drawn many miniatures into books. So before we look into the picture, let's have a look into the material. So that's made of the fibers of bark. This fibrous material is almost like paper. It's a bit different in technique than the Chinese paper making. Was then also primed with chalk, right, like limestone, as the parchments, which gives this very smooth mineralic white surface. And then it was painted by inks. So the black ink is soot. And then we have the blue and the red. The red is hematite. That's an iron oxide that also was used in Europe. The blue is indigo and is the very famous Azul de Maya, the Mayan blue. And this beautiful blue is still in the palette of today's painters. And I mean, just for a quick excursion, I mean, let's look at this website, the Color Hex lookup website. And if you type in Maya blue, you get the result, and you see the hex code that you need. For example, if you make a website, you can have the Maya blue with the hex code 73C2FB, and down you have even the mix of the RGB code also, and the CMYK. So this is important information if you want to print something in Mayan blue. Let's go back to the manuscript. What we see is calendarial painting. So this page and the page before have to do with the cycle of the planet Venus, which is described precisely in an astronomical way over a rotation period, an orbital period of 104 years. So when the planet of Venus appeared as the morning stars. The Mayan feared misfortune. And so there's several depictions of the Venus goddess coming down on people and spreading kind of this misfortune. As for all ancient civilizations, the flooding of rivers was of extreme importance to this culture. So a lot of calendarial research went into the description of the changes of the climate over the year, depending on long scale weather cycles. And this page depicts a flood catastrophe, which is very similar in the description in the text than the great flood we have in the Bible or in the Mesopotamian myth. So, there's in the middle we have the sky crocodile spewing destructive water floods, and it's signed by an eclipse of the sun, and let's just see a bit bigger. So you see these creepy looking Mayan god figures, half animals, half humans, that have these very strong lines, and you know that probably from seeing depictions like that on stones. So this is the one of the 4 Mayan codices. It is completely preserved from the first to the last page. It was bound like leporello, like folded together, so not a scroll and not a book in the traditional sense, and is now in the collection of the State Library in Dresden, in Saxony in German. So the last example that I want to share with you is again a European book of much later times. So it was written around 1530, 1531, and painted. So that is almost a century after the invention of print. So this is an interesting thing to think of people still being so much into manuscripts that they commission this super expensive painted, elaborately painted book by one of the greatest painters of its time, Jörg Breu, who lived in Nuremberg in southern Germany, today's Bavaria. And the reason why that is, it is an alchemic manuscript. So it is a kind of mysterious, kind of secret text that describes how, by means of the use of the philosopher's stone, you convert lead into gold. Of course, that is not possible, as we know, and people at that time probably knew that also, but I still kind of hope that having this kind of beautiful book and then following the totally silly instructions. I have a facsimile of that book. If you read it, it is totally silly. The recipes make no sense at all. It's just because it is these beautiful pictures on the pages that the book is of value. And this is such a stark contrast to the stupidity of the text of it that is just like in a children's book. Well, so this is the dedication page. You see the noble person in the background talking to the artist, commissioning the book. The style is Renaissance. So you see already kind of the movement towards rediscovering the ancient styles of Roman and Greek antiquity. And then the following pages show you all the alchemical mysteries. So here you see the author, which is the legendary um, uh, um, 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 the legendary Hermes Trismegistus. So this is this father of the alchemy, who is supposed to live like 300 BCE, so much earlier, and of course no one knows if he ever existed. And he's the person described as being the first to turn lead into gold. So you see him here with his flask, his vial, and out of it comes this steam that describes who he is. I mean, maybe you have also a look at the landscape, how beautifully it kind of fades into the distance in the blue, and all the animals and plants around that have nothing to do with the alchemical uh, uh, recipes. It's just for the sake of having a very beautiful book to look at. So other pages here, like this the mysterious, wild-looking man in a red harness dismembering this pale person. I mean, this is one of the, if you read the descriptions, this is one of the things that are described is this putrefaction. So you have your chemical compounds and dissolve them, and then they and kind of split them up into different subcompounds. This is symbolized here, and is of course meant to be understood in an allegorical way. If you remember, the allegory is one of these symbols that use an image to convey a concept. And then here, this is kind of chemical procedures that are conveyed by that. On the right hand side, you see kind of this king in the cauldron, boiling, and a bird coming out of the king's head. And this is, of course, not meant literally. So it's believed that this mercury being heated up and then turning into vapor, which is symbolized by this bird. And again, please look at the paintings, at the beautiful architecture, which has perspective in it. The sky and the space that is created by use of colors and lines. And another two pages. So left, this is the symbol of iron, also the planet Mars. So there are 7 planets at that time known, and they all have their page, and then some kind of things is going on that have to do with this element. And on the right-hand side, the mysterious black sun, a very dark symbol, the black sun sinking into the landscape. The interesting thing of this book is that it has much older predecessors. So it was not the first Splendor Solis, which means the glare of the sun. These pictures are very old. They are probably from the early medieval times already, used in playing cards and other symbolic depictions. So this book has been acquired around 1900 by the Prussian State Library from an unknown private collector in an auction. The book was really expensive. It was 20,000 marks, which at the time was a ridiculously high number. So people knew 150 years ago already that was a major work of art. It is still not entirely clear who made it, but there's art historic clues pointing to Jörg Breu are quite conclusive. So finally, I mean, is of course the place where books live. That is the library. So liber in Latin means book, and library therefore comes from the place where the books stay. The Greek word for book is biblos, hence the Bible, by the way. And the shelves on which you put the biblos, the book, is the bibliothek. So this is the Greek word for a library. So we have the Latin library and the Greek bibliothek. So the earliest libraries that we have seen are these cuneiform libraries from ancient Sumer, about 5,000 years ago. In Ebla in Syria, 2,500 years before our time, a library existed that we have looked at the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh with its 30,000 clay tablets. In Egypt, there were major libraries containing papyrus scrolls. Mesopotamia, Persia, today's Pakistan and India, there was a thriving library culture at least 2,500 years ago already and has continued to this day. In China, the first libraries start probably already also around that time. So there were collections of these shells, of these inscribed shells, about 1,000 to 1,500 years BCE, so that means around 3,000 years ago. However, the first libraries are the libraries with real books, the paper books, as we have seen, about 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. And then comes the classic period in Europe, Greek and Roman period, from say 2,500 years ago to maybe 1,500 years ago, so around 300 BCE to 500 CE, before the Common Era to 500 of the Common Era. And the most well-known library is, of course, the library in Alexandria in Egypt, which probably contained several 100,000 scrolls. So it was the largest library at that time, is believed. I mean, it burned down and was destroyed, so we don't know for sure. But we know that they employed about 100 full-time librarians there. So that was Alexandria, and many private libraries in late antiquity, the libraries by high-ranking civil servants, for example, libraries owned by the Roman emperors, and then, of course, a huge library culture in the Middle East, starting from Byzantium around 500, with many big libraries, and from there, of course, to Baghdad, as mentioned, and to Morocco, to North Africa, in Fez, where the oldest library that has been continuously in service still exists in Fez since the 9th century of the Common Era to this day. It's interesting to think of a library, all these books lying around. I mean, it's very hard if you think of 100,000 scrolls to know which is where. You will never find anything. So early on, people had catalogs. So the catalog in early time was organized by the so-called colophon, which is basically the title and the author of a book, and then, of course, a siegel, which is saying on which shelf the book is to be found. And that evolved later into these standardized catalog systems, which we have quite a few these days. So these catalog cards that we use today, the most well-known, of course, that you all know, is the International Standard Book Number, ISBN. So the ISBN is now a 13-digit number that starts with the European Merchant Code, EAN, which is this barcode and tells what kind of good that is. If you buy it in a shop and use a scanner, this tells what class of thing you are buying. So this is 978 for the book. And then comes the country or group of countries, which is the next 1 to 3 digits. So 0 means English. And so this is a British book, and then comes the publisher, as we shall see. This is Oxford University Press. The book number, which is arbitrary in the publisher's discretion, how to number their own books, and then a checksum that makes it robust against. I mean, if you lose one number, that's not so problematic. So this is the ISBN. Another very common classification is the Dewey Decimal Classification System. So the librarian Melville Dewey came up with this system in 1876. So Melville Dewey was one of the founding members of the American Librarian Association and later president of that, or chairman of the Librarians Association. And he was the chief librarian of the Columbia University in New York City. And so that is, of course, a huge university library. Think of New York University's library. It's also quite significant, and you need a useful system that other people understand too. And so he came up with this system that starts putting 3 digits into classifying. So let's just try that out here. I have this classifier that is the kind of official lookup system. So let's just put in the ISBN code that I just showed you and search for it. And here you see that so we have editor and author of the book, The World's Writing Systems. And I mean, that's exactly the book I put in. There's a book that I use to prepare for class. And it has the classification in the Dewey Decimal Systems 411. Let's look up what 411 means. So this is the list, and you can see that, for example, on Wikipedia, there's many pages where you can look that up. So 400 in general is languages, and 411 is a subsection of linguistics on writing systems. And that seems about right for a book that is called Writing Systems. And then, depending on the size of your library, you might have the next block of 3 digits, sub-classifications, for example, contemporary writing systems or ancient writing systems, or you might just have one shelf with 411 writing systems on it and then have the books alphabetically sorted. So, I mean, of course, these systems are all very similar to each other, and it is very useful to have the books not just alphabetically or just by size, as of course would be most economical, that you have the big books in one place and the smaller books in another place. They would fit more snugly together, but to have them grouped thematically, so that people go in and look for one book and say, well, this is also interesting. I always wanted to know that too. And this is exactly how you should use the NYU library, which is really a great resource and is also a beautiful room to spend time in. One of my favorite libraries, just to share that with you, is the Stockholm Public Library. Stockholm, the capital of Sweden in Northern Europe. This beautiful 1920s modernist Art Deco temple of books. And if you go inside, you have it's a great rotunda. All books are equally present. You just walk around and can indulge into the books in this large cylinder that goes all around. So clearly a place to spend time to find books you were not looking for. And the second library that I find always totally inspiring, and I never fail to visit when I come to Vienna, is the Austrian National Library. So the Austrian National Library is this temple of enlightenment. It is in Rococo times, that means around 1750, so 250 years ago. It looks like a cathedral, it looks like a church, but it is totally secular. It is all the knowledge that the Austrian Empire, which was the largest empire at its time, I mean, maybe aside of the Ottoman Empire, that is all the wisdom of the world. I mean, the Austrians, I mean, Spain was part of this empire too. And so everything that came from the Americas, for example, everything that came from Asia in this early phase of colonialism, all this wisdom went into the Austrian National Library. And walking around there and seeing these beautiful books, the celebration, I mean, it's lift your hearts. This is what this space tells you. I mean, you go in and you go out transformed by all the knowledge of humanity that radiates from these walls of this library. So libraries, the home of books, closing now, as we have started with the Brooklyn Public Library. So this is another of these inscriptions that I find particularly beautiful. I mean, this invitation to come and take choice of all my library and so beguile thy sorrow. Next time, we will go on with books, but much more than books, and look into printing and mass reproduction, which is truly a communication technology.